All right. Good afternoon. You know, it's funny. I set my alarm to go off 10 minutes before 4 because it was taking me so long to get set up. And now suddenly I'm like good at it and it's organized and I haven't had a technical glitch in like 4 days. So I don't actually need that time. So now I'm starting early, but I don't suppose it really matters since a lot of you tend to watch this afterwards anyway. So I'm just going with my schedule. Y'all just have to deal with the 4-minute extra ahead of time that I run. So today is a beautiful day here in Halifax, and I hope it's a lovely day where you are. Apparently, according to the guy at the checkout in the supermarket, we had 6 days of gloom. So you can see why I'm very excited that it's finally sunny. And it's warm. It's supposedly, I think they said it was going to be 16 degrees, and my car said 54 because my car speaks to me in Fahrenheit and the world speaks to me in Celsius. So it means I'm perpetually confused. Especially still, since I'm still dealing with the consequences of 4 years in Newfoundland, where it doesn't get to be 16 that frequently, so I get a little wishy-washy about 12. Anyway, also when it's above 12 in Newfoundland, you're just so excited that you don't really care how hot it is because it just feels warm. So I'm working on it. By the time they give me citizenship, hopefully I will have at least a better sense. So today I thought I would read a book called The Little House. And when I was growing up, we had a Xerox copy of this. My mother loved this book, and we had a Xerox copy of it that she had made, I think, at the library, and then put in one of those binders with the little brad clips along the side. So I don't know when I actually got the first book. I mean, clearly it's older, but my memory of it is always being read to in that with black and white pictures. I think that's the book. Anyway, it's called The Little House. I'm pretty sure it's a book my mom had as a kid. Yeah, because its copyright is 1942, so it does go back a ways. It's a pretty dedication. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house. She was strong and well built, and the man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren living in her." The little house was very happy. She sat on the hill, and she watched the countryside around her. She watched the sun in the morning, and she watched the sunrise in the morning, and she watched the sun set in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before, but the little house stayed just the same. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, and then back again to a thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars way off in the distance. She watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the lights of the city. The little house was curious about the city and wondered what it would be like to live there. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she waited for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green. She watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into bloom. She watched the children playing in the brook. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves, and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the gardens grow. She watched the apples turn red and ripen. She watched the children swimming in the pool. fall, when the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she watched the first frost. Turn the leaves to bright yellow and orange and red. She watched the harvest gathered and the apples picked. She watched the children going back to school. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days were short, and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year. The apple trees grew old, new ones were planted. The children grew up and went away to the city. And now at night, the lights of the city seemed brighter and closer. So who says coasting? I grew up with sledding, and in Atlantic Canada, sliding seems to be a word. Does anyone know where coasting comes from? What do you say? One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road. Pretty soon, there were more of them, on the road, and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon, came some surveyors and surveyed a line in front of the little house. Pretty soon came a steam shovel and dug a road through the hill covered with daisies. Some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road, and then some trucks with little stones, and some trucks with tar and sand. Finally, a steamroller came, and it rolled it all smooth, and the road was done. Oh, Now the little house watched the trucks and the automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster now than before. More roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore. She couldn't be sold for gold and silver, so she just stayed and watched. It was not so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and close. The street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the fields of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon there were trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Pretty soon there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke. The noise was so loud that it shook the little house. She couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, or fall, or winter. It all seemed about the same. Pretty soon, there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it and hear it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. Pretty soon they tore down the apartment houses and tenement houses around the little house and started digging big cellars, one on each side. the steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other. Pretty soon they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 stories on the other. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon. She didn't see the moon or stars at night at all. Because the lights of the city were so bright. She didn't like living in the city. At night she used to dream of the country and the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty, her windows broken, and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, though she was just as good a house as ever underneath. Then one fine morning in spring, along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the shabby little house, but she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. She said to her husband, "That little house looks just like the little house my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was way out in the country on a hill covered with daisies and apple trees growing around." They found out it was the very same house, and they went to the movers to see if the little house could be moved. The movers looked the little house over and said, "Sure, this house is as good as ever. She's so well built that we could move her anywhere." They jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. At first, the little house was frightened. After she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along the big road, and they rolled along the little roads, until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here, they tried the little house there. Finally, they saw a little hill in the middle of a field and apple trees growing around. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter, "that's just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and slowly they moved the house up from the road to the hill. The windows and the shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again she could watch the moon, and she could watch the sun and moon and stars. Once again she could watch spring and summer and fall and winter come and go. Once again she was lived in and taken care of. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. A new moon was coming up. It was spring, and all was quiet and peaceful in the country. The end. Now, I've always thought that story was quite sad, even with the happy ending, because I always thought of all the other little houses and the little houses that you walk past that you see that don't get to be saved and go and live in the country. Maybe that's partly why I became interested in historic preservation of various types. All right, moving on to something a bit different. We are up to chapter 12 in the Phantom Tollbooth. This is the Silent Valley. Oh, excuse me. "How agreeable and pleasant this valley is," thought Milo, as once again they bounced along the highway, with the humbug humming snatches of old songs to his own vast amusement, and Talk sniffing contentedly at the wind. I really can't see what Dr. Discord was so concerned about. There certainly couldn't be anything unpleasant along this road. And just as the thought crossed his mind, they passed through a heavy stone gateway, and everything was different. At first, it was difficult to tell just what had changed, for it all looked the same and it smelled the same, but for some reason, nothing sounded the same. I wonder what's happened, said Milo. At least that's what he tried to say, for though his lips moved, not a sound came from his mouth. And suddenly he realized what it was, for Talk was no longer ticking, and the humbug, though happily singing, was doing so in complete silence. The wind no longer rustled the trees, the car no longer squeaked, the insects no longer buzzed in the fields. Not the slightest thing could be heard. It felt as if, in some mysterious way, a switch had been thrown, and all the sound in the world had been turned off in the same instant. The humbug, suddenly realizing what had happened, leaped to his feet in terror, and Tuck worriedly checked to see if he was still keeping time. It was certainly a strange feeling to know that no matter how loudly or softly you chatted or rattled or bumped, it all came out the same way, as nothing. How dreadful, thought Milo as he slowed down the car. The three of them began to talk and shout at once with absolutely no result, until, hardly noticing where they were going, they had driven into the midst of a large crowd of people marching along the road. Some were singing at the tops of their non-existent voices, and others were carrying large signs which proclaimed, "Down with silence! All quiet is no diet! It's laudable to be audible! More sound for all!" And one enormous banner simply stated, "Hear, hear." Oops, can't see that, can you? Except for these and the big brass cannon being pulled along behind, they looked very much like the residents of any other small valley to which you've never been. When the car had stopped, one of them held up a placard which said, "Welcome to the Valley of Sound," and the others cheered as loudly as possible, which was not very loudly at all. "Have you come to help us?" asked another, stepping forward with a question. "Please," added a third. Milo tried desperately to say who he was and where he was going, but to no avail. As he did, 4 more placards announced, "Listen," crossed out, "look carefully, and we will tell you our terrible misfortune." And while 2 of them held up a large blackboard, a third, writing as fast as he could, explained why there was nothing but quiet in the Valley of Sound. "At a place in the valley not far from here," he began, "where the echoes used to gather and the winds come to rest, there is a great stone fortress, and in it lives the Sound Keeper who rules this land. When the old King of Wisdom drove the demons into distant mountains, he appointed her as guardian of all sounds and noises, past, present, and future. For years she ruled as a wise and beloved monarch, each morning at sunrise releasing the day's new sounds to be borne by the winds through and continued anew from the top. She was generous to a fault and provided us with all the sound we could possibly use, for singing as we work, for bubbling pots of stew, for the chop of an axe and the crash of a tree, for the creak of a hinge and the hoot of an owl, for the squish of a shoe in the mud, and the friendly tapping of rain on the roof, and for sweet music of pipes and sharp snap of winter ice cracking on the ground." He paused again as a tear of longing rolled from cheek to lip, and the sweet, salty taste of an old memory. That's a great line. All these sounds, when once used, would be carefully placed in alphabetical order and neatly kept for future reference. Everyone lived in peace, and the valley flourished as a happy home of sound. And then things began to change. Oh, excuse me. I don't know why I'm so yawny. Slowly at first, and then in a rush, more people came to settle here and brought with them new ways and new sounds, some very beautiful and some less so. But everyone was so busy with the things that had to be done that they scarcely had time to listen at all. And as you know, a sound which is not heard disappears forever and is not to be found again. People laughed less and grumbled more, sang less and shouted more. The sounds they made grew louder and uglier. It became difficult to hear even the birds or the breeze, and soon everyone stopped listening to them. He cleared the backboard again as the humbug choked back a sob and continued writing. The soundkeeper grew worried and disconsolate. Every day there were fewer sounds to be collected, and most of those were hardly worth keeping. Many people thought it was the weather, and others blamed the moon. But the general consensus of opinion held that the trouble began at the time rhyme and reason were banished. But no matter what the cause, no one knew what to do. Then one day, Dr. Discord appeared in the valley with his wagon of medicines and the bluish, smoggy din. He made a thorough examination and promised to cure everyone of everything, and the soundkeeper let him try. He gave several bad-tasting spoonfuls of medicine to every adult and child, and it worked, but not really as expected, for he cured everyone of everything but noise. The soundkeeper became furious. She chased him from the valley forever and then issued the following decree. From this day forward, the valley of sound shall be silent, since sound is no longer appreciated, I hereby abolish it. Please return all used amounts to the fortress immediately. And that's the way it's been ever since, he concludes sadly. There's nothing we can do to change it, and every day new hardships are reported. A small man with arms full of letters and messages pushed through the crowd and offered them to Milo. Milo took one which read, Dear Soundkeeper, we had a thunderstorm last week, and the thunder still hasn't arrived. How long should we wait? Truly yours, a friend. Then he looked at a telegram which stated, Band concert, great success, stop. When may we expect the music? Stop. Now you see, continued the writer, why you must help us attack the fortress and free sound. What can I do? Wrote Milo. You must visit the soundkeeper and bring from the fortress one sound, no matter how small, with which to load our cannon. For if we can reach the walls with the slightest noise, they will collapse and free the rest. It won't be easy, for she is hard to deceive, but you must try. Milo thought for a moment, and then, with a resolute I shall, volunteered to go. Within a few minutes, he stood bravely at the fortress door. Knock, knock, he wrote neatly on a piece of paper, which he pushed under the crack. In a minute, the great portal swung open, and it closed behind him. A gentle voice rang out, I'm right this way. I'm in the parlor. Can I talk now? Cried Milo, happily hearing his voice once again. Yes, but only in here, she replied softly. Now do come into the parlor. Milo walked slowly down the long hallway into the little room where the soundkeeper sat listening intently to an enormous radio set, whose switches, dials, knobs, meters, speakers covered one whole wall, and which at the moment was playing nothing. Here's the soundkeeper. Isn't that lovely, she sighed. It's my favorite program. 15 minutes of silence, and after that there's a half an hour of quiet and an interlude of lull. Why, did you know there are almost as many kinds of stillness as there are sounds? But sadly enough, no one pays any attention to them these days. Have you heard the wonderful silence that comes just before dawn? She inquired, or the quiet and calm just as the storm ends? Or perhaps you know the silence when you haven't the answer to the question you've been asked, or the hush of a country road at night, or the expectant pause in a room full of people when someone is just about to speak, or the most beautiful at all, the moment after the door closes and you're all alone in the whole house. Each one is different, you know, and all very beautiful, if you listen carefully. As she spoke, thousands of little bells and chimes, which covered her from head to toe, tinkled softly, as if in reply. The telephone began to ring too. For someone who loves silence, she certainly talks a great deal, thought Milo. At one time, I was able to listen to any sound made any place at any time, the soundkeeper remarked, but pointing to the radio wall. But now I merely... Pardon me, interrupted Milo as the phone continued to ring. Aren't you going to answer it? Oh, no, not in the middle of the program, she replied, and turned the silence up a little louder. But it may be important, insisted Milo. Not at all, she assured him. It's only me. It gets so lonely around here with no sounds to describe or collect that I call myself 7 or 8 times a day, just to see how I am. How are you? He asked politely. Not very well, I'm afraid. I seem to have a touch of static, she complained. But what brings you here? Of course you've come to tour our vaults. Well, they're usually open to the public only on Mondays from 2 to 4, but since you've traveled so far, we'll have to make an exception. Follow me, please. She quickly bounced to her feet with a chorus of jingles and chimes and started down the hallway. Don't you just love jingles and chimes? I do, she answered quickly. Besides, they're very convenient, for I'm always getting lost in this big fortress, and all I have to do is listen for them, and I know exactly where I am. They entered a tiny cage-like elevator and traveled down for fully 3/4 of a minute, stopping finally in an immense vault, whose lines of file drawers and storage bins stretched in all directions. Where here began to where there ended, and from floor to ceiling. Every sound that's ever been made in history is kept here, said the soundkeeper, skipping down one of the corridors with Milo in hand. For instance, look here. She opened one of the drawers and pulled out a small brown envelope. This is the exact tune George Washington whistled when he crossed the Delaware on that icy night in 1777. Milo peered into the envelope, and sure enough, that's exactly what was in it. But why do you collect them all? He asked as she closed the door. If we didn't collect them, said the soundkeeper as they continued to stroll through the vaults, the air would be full of old sounds and noises bouncing around and bumping into things. It would be terribly confusing, because you'd never know whether you were listening to an old one or a new one. Besides, I do like to collect things, and there are more sounds than almost anything else. Why, I have everything here, from the buzz of a mosquito 1,000,000 years ago to what your mother said to you this morning. If you come back here in 2 days, I'll tell you what she said tomorrow. It's really quite simple. Let me show you. Say a word, any word. Hello, said Milo, for that was all he could think of. Where do you think that went? She asked with a smile. I don't know, said Milo, shrugging his shoulders. I always thought that. Most people do. She hummed, peering down to one of the corridors. Now let me see. First we find the cabinet with today's sounds. Ah, here it is. Then we look under G for greetings, and then under M for Milo. And here it is, already in its envelope. So you see, the whole system is quite automatic. It's a shame we hardly use it anymore. That's wonderful, gasped Milo. May I have one little sound as a souvenir? Certainly, she said with pride, and then immediately thinking better of it, added, not. And don't try and take one, because that's strictly against the rules. Milo was crestfallen. He had no idea how to steal a sound, even the smallest one, for the soundkeeper always had at least one eye focused on him. Now for a look at the workshops, she cried, whisking him through another door and into a large abandoned laboratory full of old pieces of equipment, all untended and rusting. This is where we used to invent sounds, she said wistfully. Do they have to be invented? Asked Milo, who seemed surprised at almost everything she told him. I thought they just were. No one realizes how much trouble we go through to make them, she complained. Why, at one time this shop was crowded and busy from morning to night. How do you invent a sound? Milo inquired. Oh, that's easy, she said. First, you must decide exactly what sound looks like, for each sound has its own exact shape and size. Then you must make some of them here in the shop, grind each one 3 times into an invisible powder, and throw a little of each into the air every time you need it. But I've never seen a sound, Milo insisted. You never see them out there, she said, waving her arm in the general direction everywhere, except every once in a while, on a very cold morning, when they freeze. But in here, we see them all the time. Here, let me show you. She picked up a padded stick and struck a nearby bass drum 3 times. 6 large, woolly, fluffy cotton balls, each about 2 feet across, rolled silently into the floor. You see, she said, putting some of them in a large grinder. Now listen. And she took a pinch of the invisible powder and threw it into the air, with a boom, boom, boom. Do you know what a hand clap looks like? Milo shook his head. Try it, she commanded. He clapped his hand once, and a single sheet of clean paper fluttered to the floor. He tried it 3 more times, and 3 more sheets of paper did the very same thing. And then he applauded as fast as he could, and a great cascade of paper filled the air. Doesn't that make total sense as to what, like, booms are fluffy and claps are like paper? He's very clever, the author. Isn't that simple? And it's the same for all sounds. If you think about it, you'll soon know what each one looks like. Take laughter, for instance, she said, laughing briskly, and 1,000 tiny, brightly colored bubbles flew into the air and popped noiselessly. Or speech, she continued. Some of it is light and airy, some sharp and pointed, but most of it, I'm afraid, is just heavy and dull. How about music? Asked Milo excitedly. Right over here. We weave it on our looms. Symphonies are large, beautiful carpets with all the rhythms and melodies woven in. Concertos are these tapestries, and other bolts of cloth are serenades, waltzes, overtures, and rhapsodies. We also have some songs that you often sing, she cried, holding up a handful of brightly colored handkerchiefs. She stopped for a moment and said sadly, We even had one section over there that did nothing but put the sound of the ocean into seashells. This was once such a happy place. Then why don't you make sounds for everyone now? He shouted. So eagerly the soundkeeper leaped back in surprise. Don't shout, young man. If there's one thing we need more of around here, it's less noise. Now come with me, and I'll tell you all about it. And put that down immediately. Her last remark was directed towards Milo's effort to stuff one of the drum beats into his back pocket. She returned quickly to the parlor, and when the soundkeeper had settled herself into a chair and carefully tuned the radio to a special hour of hush, Milo asked his question once again in a somewhat lower voice. It doesn't make me happy to hold back sounds, she began softly, for if we listen to them carefully, they can sometimes tell us things far better than words. But if that's so, asked Milo, he had doubt it ever was, shouldn't you release them? Never, she cried. They just use them to make horrible noises, which are ugly to see and worse to hear. I leave all that to Dr. Discord and that awful, awful din. But some noises are good noises, aren't they? He insisted. That may be true, she replied suddenly. But if they won't make the sounds that I like, they won't make any. But, he started to say, but got no further than that. For while he was about to say that he didn't think that quite fair, a thought to which the obstinate soundkeeper might not have taken kindly, he suddenly discovered the way he would carry his little sound from the fortress. In the interest between saying the word and before it sailed into the air, he had clamped his lips shut, and the but was trapped in his mouth, all made but not spoken. Now, I mustn't keep you all day, she said impatiently. Now turn your pockets out so I can see you didn't steal anything, and you can be on your way. When he had satisfied the soundkeeper, he nodded his farewell, for it would have been impractical to say thank you or good afternoon, and raced out the door. I don't want to leave you hanging. I think I'll read the beginning of chapter 13, just so you can get to the end of this little story, so you can find out what happens to the but. But I'll save the rest of the chapter for later. Chapter 13, Unfortunate Conclusions. With his mouth tightly shut and his feet moving as fast as his thoughts could make them, Milo ran all the way back to the car. There was great excitement when he arrived, as talk raced happily down the road to greet him. The humbug personally accepted all congratulations from the crowd. Where's the sound? Someone hastily scribbled on the blackboard, and they all waited anxiously for the reply. Milo caught his breath, picked up the chalk, and explained simply, It's on the tip of my tongue. Several people excitedly threw their hats in the air. Some shouted what would have been a very loud hurrah, and the rest pushed the heavy cannon into place. They aimed it directly at the thickest part of the fortress walls and packed it with gunpowder. Milo stood on tiptoe, leaned over the cannon's mouth, and parted his lips. The small sound dropped silently to the bottom, and everything was ready. Another moment the fuse was lit and sputtering. There's the transfer of the sound. I hope no one gets hurt, thought Milo. And before he had time to think again, an immense cloud of gray and white smoke leapt from the gun along with it. So softly that it was hardly heard came the sound of but. It flew towards the wall for several seconds into a high, lazy arc, and then struck ever so lightly just to the right of the big door. For an instant there was an ominous stillness, quieter and more silent than ever before, as if even the air was holding its breath. And then, almost immediately, there was a blasting, roaring, thundering smash, followed by a crushing, shattering, bursting crash, as every stone in the fortress came toppling to the ground and the vaults burst open, spilling the sounds of history into the wind. Every sound that had ever been uttered or made, from way back when there were none to way up when there were too many, came hurling out of the debris in a way that sounded as though everyone in the world was laughing, whistling, shouting, crying, singing, whispering, humming, screaming, coughing, and sneezing all at the same time. There were little bits of old speeches floating about, as well as recited lessons, gunshots from old wars, babies' cries, auto horns, waterfalls, electric fans, galloping horses, and a great deal of everything else. For a while, there was total deafening confusion, and then, almost as quickly as they'd come, all the old sounds disappeared over the hill in search of their new freedom, and things were normal again. People quickly went about their busy, talkative business as the smoke and dust cleared. Only Milo, Talk, and the Humbug noticed the soundkeeper sitting disconsolately onto a pile of rubbish. "I'm terribly sorry," said Milo sympathetically, as the three of them went to console her. "But we had to do it," added Talk, sniffing around the ruins. "What a terrible mess," observed the Humbug, with his knack for saying exactly the wrong thing. The soundkeeper looked around with an expression of unrelieved sadness on her unhappy face. "It will take years to collect all those sounds again," she sobbed, "but even longer to put them back in proper order. But it's all my fault, for you can't improve sound by having only silence. The problem is to use each at a proper time." As she spoke, the familiar and unmistakable squinch, squanch of Din's heavy footsteps could be heard plodding over the hill, and when he finally appeared, he was dragging an incredibly large sack behind him. "Can anyone use these sounds?" he puffed, mopping his forehead. "They've all come over the hill at once, and none of them are awful enough for me." The soundkeeper peered into the sack, and there were all the sounds which had burst from the vaults. "How nice of you to return them," she cried happily. "And you and the doctor must come by for an evening of beautiful music when my fortress is repaired." The thought so horrified the Din that he excused himself immediately and dashed off down the road in a great panic. "I hope I haven't offended him," she said with some concern. "He only likes unpleasant sounds," volunteered Talk. "Ah, yes," she sighed. "I keep forgetting that many people do. But I suppose they are necessary, for you'd never really know how pleasant one was unless you knew how unpleasant it wasn't." She paused for a moment and continued. "If only Rhyme and Reason were here, I'm sure things would improve." "That's where we're going to rescue them," said Milo proudly. "What a long, hard journey that will be. You'll need some nourishment," she cried, handing Milo a small brown package neatly wrapped and tied with string. "Now remember, they're not for eating, but for listening, because you'll often be hungry for sounds as well as food. Hear street noises at night, train whistles a long way off, dry leaves burning, busy department stores, crunching toast, creaking bed springs, and of course, all kinds of laughter. There's a little of each, and in far-off lonely places, I think you'll be glad to have them all." "I'm sure we will," replied Milo gratefully. "Just take this road to the sea and turn left," she told them, "and you'll soon be in Digitopolis." And almost before she had finished, they had said goodbye and left the valley behind them. And that's where we will leave them until tomorrow. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon. Bye.